What if I told you DC's scariest villain isn't even Joker? It's not even Darkseid. It's not even the Batman. It's the man who desperately wanted to be beautiful. And he got exactly what he wished for. October 21st, 2026, Clayface hits theaters. And James Gunn is calling it the pure horror. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Tanveer Talks, and I am Tanveer, and today we are melting into the mud. 2026 is officially shaping up to be the year of shapeshifters. Marvel's doing their own thing with supplies and street level threats, but DC basically said, hold my Clayface, Clayface is dropping October 23rd, 2026, and everything we know about it suggests that this is not your typical Cape Crusader movie. This is a psychological body horror, right? This is a tragedy. This is in James Gunn's own words, pure horror, right? Today we are going to be breaking down the film, the creative team, the tech choices, the comic roots, and, we're throwing it up against Marvel's own shapeshifter to see, who actually wins the identity crisis of 2026. So let's get into it. So let's start with the basics, Clayface is part of James Gunn and Peter Safran's DCU, Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, right? This is the new DC universe, right? They've been carefully building, right? And the Clayface is one of the first films to, really lean into what James Gunn describes as grounded character first approach. The director is James Watkins. If you know his work on Women in Black or Speak No Evil, you already know the vibe, right? This is a guy who understands dread. He understands slow burn terror, right? He's basically the right choice for this story, right? The lead role is Matt Hagen, went to, Welsh actor Tom Rice Harris after what was described as a massive exhaustive search. And look, if you haven't seen Harris before, the man has range, he can do vulnerable, he can do desperate. Both of these are exactly what Matt Hagen needs. And you may ask, who is Matt Hagen, right? In this version of the story, Hagen is an up-and-coming actor in Hollywood, right? His career is on the rise. His identity is literally tied to his face, how he looks, how the world perceives him. Then a gangster, brutalizes him, and his face is disfigured. His career, everything he's built is gone. In desperation, he turns to a fringe scientist named Dr. Caitlin Bates, played by Naomi Ackie. And Naomi Ackie, by the way, is she's a incredible casting choice. We saw her commanding presence in Star Wars. She brings legitimacy and moral ambiguity to a role that could easily be one note, right? Bates transforms Hagen's body, using science that is very much not fully understood into clay, and things basically go horribly physically wrong. The script actually was written by Mike Flanagan, the master behind The Haunting of Hill House and The Midnight Mass, and later refined by Hussein Amini. And Gunn and Safran have described the results as a psychological body horror tragedy that they say is equally resonant and more terrifying than, both The Penguin and The Joker. The tonal reference they keep coming back to is the 1986 classic The Fly. Think Jeff Goldblum. Think body that betrays the mind. Think a man becoming something monstrous while desperately clinging to his humanity. This, that is the emotional engine of this film. And there's a reason it's R-rated because of that, right? This is a story about a man losing his identity, his physicality, and his mind simultaneously. And now for the tech heads in the audience. This is where Clayface gets genuinely interesting from a production standpoint. We are in an era where, every monster, every transformation, every otherworldly creature is like a CGI blur. I know that's kind of a problem because digital effects, when they aren't photorealistic, create, emotional distance. You see the render, not the horror. James Gunn made a deliberate pivot here. He pushed hard for practical effects and physical makeup to bring, Clayface to life. He argued that the, creature would look better built in camera rather than composited in post. This wasn't just a creative choice. It was also a financial strategy, right? By leaning into prosthetics over CGI pipelines, AI-driven liquid simulations, they kept the budget stripped down to reported $40 to $45 million. Right? That is a bold number for a superhero movie. basically for a supervillain movie, right? In 2026. And it signals something important. They believe in the material and in the craftsmanship enough to not throw a Marvel tier budget at it, right? Set photos already leaked showing, Tom Harris in heavy bandages and prosthetics work, Director James Watkin is clearly committed to that authentic, tangible horror aesthetics. The audience should feel the grossness of the transformation, right? They should feel the wrongness of what is happening to Hagen's body. You cannot get that, from a render form. This is, for me, like, this is actually the right call. Honestly, right? Like, it's actually refreshing to see, DC production lean into craftsmanship over spectacle. So, for the long-time comic fans, let's talk about where this character actually comes from. Because the film's DNA is pure nostalgia. The animated series connection, the Mike Flanagan confirmed that the primary inspiration for his original script was the legendary Batman the Animated Series. Then the two-part episode of Feet of Clay. If you grew up watching Batman, right, that episode actually hits hard. That it's told the tragedy of Mad Hagen with real emotional weight. It has aged beautifully. And then the character mashup now in the comics, there are actually multiple Clayfaces. Like it's basically a legacy villain name. The original Matt Hagen was a treasure hunter who stumbled upon a pool of protoplasm, classic Silver Age stuff. But then there's Basil Carlo, the actor, man obsessed with performance and identity. The 2026 film is doing what the animated series, did brilliantly, taking the name Matt Hagen, but grafting it on the Basil Carlo's backstory. An actor, man whose face is literally his career. The man so consumed by vanity, desperation, that he makes the worst possible choice. The tragedy of beauty. This version of Hagen isn't a criminal mastermind at the start, He uses an illegal chemical to maintain his appearance. He's literally addicted to being beautiful, And that's a deeply human, deeply sad thing to explore. Right? Tragedy of beauty is what makes Clayface compelling as more than just a monster of the week. His physical horror mirrors his existential dread, He is, as one description I read put it, right, a sad-eyed villain, and those are the best kind. Okay, let's have some fun. Who wins the shape-shifting arms race in 2026? DC or Marvel? Two matchups we're thinking about are Clayface versus Sandman. Sandman's Flint Marco is the elemental comparison. Sand versus Clay. Both are malleable. Both can reshape. The classic weakness debate is Sandman's greatest vulnerability is water, which soaks him, collapses, his molecular structure, turns him into mud. And guess what Clayface essentially is? Sentient living mud. So on contact, Clayface might actually neutralize Sandman's form rather than, get destabilized by it. The counter argument is that the Sandman can grow to like a colossal scale, like city block size in his strongest showings. Clayface's mass is generally constrained to his own body, so the scale matters in like a street fight. So edge here is like Clayface in a contained environment, Sandman in an open field. Call it a draw with the situational advantages on both sides. And the second pair is the Clayface versus the Chameleon. The Chameleon, Dmitry Smerdyakov, is Marvel's, matter of master of disguise. But here's the thing, Chameleon traditionally relies on technology, lifelike masks, holographic belts. He's a spy, not a supernatural entity. The comparison to Clayface only really works on a psychological level. And that's actually, where it gets interesting. Clayface in this film is being written with traits of identity disturbance. His DNA is splintering. His sense of self is fragmenting as his form becomes fluid. The obsession with being perceived a certain way, the desperation to maintain a face that reads as a kind of histrionic personality disorder, right? Made literal and physical. Chameleon, on the other hand, is often written as someone who has lost his sense of self entirely, like from spending too much time being other people. He's psychologically hollow. His obsession with Peter Parker and his complicated half-brother dynamic with Kraven the Hunter fills that void. with mania, and Clayface is a monster of mass and grief. Chameleon is a monster of the mind game. Both are terrifying for completely different reasons. And let's step back to the big picture here. Like 2026 is the year you cannot trust anyone's face. Marvel is rumored to be rebooting the Chameleon for the MCU in the Spider-Man Brand New Day, which is actually slated for July 31st, 2026. And then 3 months later, Clayface arrives as Halloween horror event on October 23rd. Both studios are simultaneously moving away from like a cosmic world-ending threats and towards internal identity-based horror. Like this is not actually a coincidence, right? This is actually culture movement. One is a street-level spy thriller, other is a $40 million body horror experiment. Whether you prefer Marvel's espionage game or DC's psychological nightmare fuel, 2026 is going to define these villains not by their power level, but by the inability to know who they are. And Clayface is like the sad, desperate, beautiful monster. Might be the most human of all of them. Okay. This was our deep dive on Clayface, October 23rd, 2026. Don't expect to leave that theater feeling clean. This genuinely, excites me. Not because it's going to break the box office records, but because it's being made with intention, practical effects, a horror director with a track record, a tragic character who actually means something, and a budget that forces creativity. And that combination does not come around often. I'll be watching this one actually really closely, and I'll be covering it right here when more trailer, more teaser actually drops. So if this episode actually gave you something to think about, share it, send it to that one fan who keeps telling you, your DC is done. Let them hear this. And if you're listening to Spotify, follow the show. It costs you nothing and tells the algorithm, that, Tribute Talks is actually worth pushing to New Year's. Even every follow, generally matters at this stage. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, like, and share, and hit that notification bell. I drop episodes weekly, and I do not want you to missing on a single one. So find me on X at Punjabi Gamer 786. I talk comics, DC, Marvel, gaming, tech, all of it. Come argue with me. I welcome it. Drop a comment here on YouTube as well, and the Spotify reviews, and tell me are you more hyped for Clayface or Spider-Man Brand New Day? Because I genuinely want to know where you are landing. Right? So this has been Tanveer Talks, and so see you in next episode. Peace.